Chapter 28 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 28. Down the middle of the big T-shaped woolshed, in 2 rows of 6 pens each, with an aisle between them, the bleating sheep were massed. They had been driven into that aisle and thus distributed, as a crowd of soldiers might be packed into their pews at church, and 12 little gates then been shut upon them. Each gate had a corresponding one at the opposite end of the pen, opening upon a broad lane of floor, and facing a doorway into outside pens and the sunny paddocks of the background. Between gate and door, on his own section of the boarded lane, a sweating, bare-armed man with shears performed prodigies of strength and skill. Every few minutes he snatched a heavy sheep from the pen beside him, flung it with a round turn into a sitting posture between his knees, and with the calm indifference to its violent objections of the spider to those of the fly that he makes into a parcel, sliced off its coat like a cook peeling a potato. The fleece gently fell upon the floor, as you may see an unnoticed shawl slip from an old lady's shoulders, and before it could realize what had happened, the poor naked animal found itself shot through the doorway, to stagger headlong down the sloping stage that was its returning path to freedom. 12 of these stalwart and strenuous operators, lining the long walls at regular intervals, 6 aside, were at it with might and main, pavement by results being the rule in this department of industry, and attendant boys strolled up and down, picking the fleeces from the floor and carrying them to the sorter's table. One was the tar boy, whose business was to dab a brushful of tar upon any scarlet patch appearing upon a white undercoat where the shears had clipped too close. The sorter or classer stood behind his long table, above at right angles to the lines of sheep pens and shearers. Near him on either hand were racks like narrow loose boxes, built against the walls. Behind him the hydraulic press cranked and creaked as its attendants fed and manipulated it, and the great bales that others were sewing up, weighing and branding, were mounting high in the transepts of the building, the 2 arms of the capital T. The air was thick with woolly particles and the smell of sheep. The floor was dark and slippery, and everything one touched humid with the impalpable grease of the silky fleeces circulating all about the shed. Strict, downright, dirty business was the order of the day. The manager, Jim Urquhart, grey-bearded, in a battered felt hat and a slouchy old tweed suit, stood by the sorter's table, his wide-ranging vigilant eye suddenly fixed upon it. As each fleece was brought up, shaken out, trimmed, tested with thumb and finger, rolled into a light bundle inside out, and flung into one another of the adjacent racks, he followed the process as if it were something new to him. The shade of difference in the texture of the staple of one fleece, as compared with another, appeared of more concern to him than the absolute difference, which seemed to shout for notice, between Deborah Dalzell and the other features of the scene. A snowy, lacy petticoat all but swept the greasy floor. An equally spotless skirt, fresh from the laundry, gathered up in one strong pendant hand, gleamed like light against its background of greasy woodwork and greasy wool. The majestic figure of the lady of Redford advanced towards him. Her lord strolled behind her. Often, but not for many a long day, had the vision of her beautiful face come to Jim in this fashion, a radiance upon a prosaic business that it was not allowed to interfere with. Now, for the first time, his eye avoided, his heart shrank from recognizing it. Then he lifted his gaze at last, for she was close beside him, and what a ray of loving old comradeship shone on him from those star-bright orbs of hers, undulled by the years that had lightly frosted her dark hair. She put out her hand, and held it out until he had apologized for his greasy paw, and given it to her warm grasp. "Why haven't you been to see me, to see us?" she asked him, smiling. "Didn't you know we came home last night?" "I thought you might be tired, or unpacking," Jim lamely excused himself. "But whenever it is convenient to you, Deb, Mrs Dalzell, I am always close by. I can come at any time." He looked at her husband. "Claud, you remember Jim?" It was so many years since the men had met that the question was not uncalled for. They nodded to each other, across the enormous gulf that separated them, while Deb explained to her husband what an invaluable manager she had. Jim had grown homelier and shabbier with his advancing years, Claude more and more exquisitely finished, until he now stood in his carefully careless costume, his short, pointed beard the same tone of silver grey as his flannel suit, his finely chiselled features the hue of old ivory, a perfect model of patrician form, only there was plenty of vigour still manifest in the bushman's bony frame, while the man of the world wore a valeduderian air, leaning on the arm of his regal, upright wife. "Eh, isn't it like old times?" she mused aloud, as her eyes roamed about the shed, where every sweating worker was finding time to gaze at her. "I see some of the old faces. There's Harry Fox, and old David, and isn't that Keziah's grandson? I must go and speak to them." She left her husband at the sorter's table, that he and Jim might get reacquainted. Men never learned to know each other while women were in the way, and it seemed to them both a long time before she came back. Claud asked questions about the clip, and other matters of business, and he criticised the manager's management. "Rather behind the times, isn't it, for a place like Redford? I thought all the big stations sheared by machinery now." "I've only been waiting for Mrs Dalzell's return to advise her to have the machines," said Jim, scrupulous to give Deb's husband all possible information. "We must have them, of course. I believe in scientific methods." Mr Dalzell did not ask Jim how his sisters were, and how his brothers were getting on; did not remember that he had any; and when Deb came back, to be gently but firmly ordered out of that dirty place by her new lord and master, the latter failed to take, although he did not fail to perceive, the hint of her eyes that Jim should be asked to dinner. "No," said he, linking his arm in hers as they left the shed. "No outsiders, Debbie. I want you all to myself now." And the words and tone were so sweet to her that she could not be sorry for the possible hurt to Jim's feelings. She was young again today, with her world-weary husband making love to her like this. That theory of their having come together merely to keep each other warm on the cold road to the grave was laughingly flung to the winds. She laid her strong right hand on his, limp upon her arm, and expanded her deep chest to the sunny morning air. "Oh, Claud! Oh, isn't it wonderful, after all these years?